Possession and exorcism stories have been popular genre in books, movies, and television for decades. Recently, however, a more interesting discussion on the nature of exorcisms, their effect, and the reality of possessions have been addressed by discussion boards and documentaries, often criticising the treatment of the possessed, which is usually young women or girls. These girls are often mistreated by their family, the church, and society as a whole. Many past cases of real possessions have been called into question and seemingly explained by conditions such as DID and schizophrenia. A Head Full of Ghosts explores the reality of religious hysteria in relation to mental health and the nature of exorcisms through the eyes of a child. Hey everyone, welcome back to the third book on the Disturbing Iceberg chart and the first book that doesn't have a movie adaptation, so I can't really use footage for it, obviously. Expect a lot of seeing my face and whatever B-roll or stock images I can find. As usual, there will be a lot of spoilers ahead for the book, as I'm going to break down everything that happened so that you wouldn't have to read it if you didn't want to. I'm going to rate it on how disturbing it is and how good it is at the end of the video. For a spoiler-free rating, check the description of the video. And with that, let's just get on to the book introduction, because this is going to be a long one. A Head Full of Ghosts is a horror novel published by Paul Tremblay in 2015. It's one of the more recent books on the list and is the first true horror novel we've come across, and is therefore the first book on the list that is actively trying to scare the reader. Therefore, it's a little bit easier for me to be more critical of it if it fails to elicit any fear. I swear Stephen King has read every horror novel in existence, because so many of the books I've read from this list have his review on the front cover. The book was written after Tremblay read a series of essays on The Exorcist, the famous book turned movie that inspired a lot of the popularity for possession and exorcism media. He wrote it to fill in for the lack of modern possession books and succeeded in bringing a more modern light to the genre. The book is generally praised and has won some awards for horror literature. However, I have seen a lot of bad reviews for the book that mainly focus on Tremblay's style of writing. It's a bit of a hit or miss for some people, but as always, I will be forming my own opinions. Let's get into the summary, shall we? Once again, this story is told to us in 3 parts. Part 1. The novel starts by introducing us to our narrator, Meredith Barrett, who's mainly referred to as her nickname Mary for the duration of the novel. She's visiting her childhood home with a writer who is paying to hear her story, a story that the author plans to write a book about. We get the impression that something terrible has happened here. Rachel, the writer, remarks that it must be difficult for Mary, who replies that it is. Mary, however, is a little sarcastic and seems to put up a front of casualty when discussing the book with Rachel. She even jokes that Rachel should use her childhood home as a sort of tourist attraction. As mentioned, Mary is the narrator and the eyes of which we see the events of the story, but the main character and the events that revolve around it is basically Marjorie, which is her older sister. Mary even says this herself at the start of the book. Mary settles in to tell Rachel her story, but warns her that some parts of the memory are obscured by trauma and the amount of time passed. This is to be expected, of course. Her other reasons for potential inaccuracies are less expected. Mary tells Rachel she finds it difficult to distinguish between what she remembers happening and what's been fabricated by the media regarding the situations portrayed in her family's documentary. Rachel's role, in turn, is to point out some of the discrepancies and provide context so that the reader can fully piece the story together. The majority of the novel is told to us in a flashback from Mary when Mary was 8 and witnessing to the best of her childlike ability the traumatic events that the book centres around. There are 3 perspectives we jump to from within the novel. The first chapters and further chapters are from the perspective of a 23-year-old Mary, which is the one we've just received. The other is the previously mentioned flashback version of Mary at 8, and the last perspective we get is questionable. We get another perspective from an occult blogger called Karen that seems to be obsessed with the possession. The reality TV show / sort of documentary that captured the events that unfolded with the Barretts. She relays all the episodes on her blogs and gives analysis and behind the scenes information on the show, kind of like what I'm doing here with the book. When we get into the next chapter, it's Karen narrating. She prefaces her analysis by explaining in great detail the background and context of the series, and heavily implies that the show was much more exaggerated reality TV than it was documentary, with the man of the family, John Barrett, being painted by the show as the main protagonist. She further accuses the show of downplaying the role of the children, and particularly the mother of the family, in order to focus the situation from John's point of view. She also implies that the show uses John as a sort of symbol of the economic downfall of America and how it can affect the perfect picket white fence family. This sounds a little bit far-fetched, but after reading like her blogs and the rest of the book, I see what she's talking about. For example, despite Marjorie being the victim of all aspects of the show, the Possession crew really do lean towards showing these events as the unfortunate reality of the classic American family in financial and spiritual difficulties. They use Marjorie's possession and the public's fascination with it to present a narrative of John, a formerly religious man, turning again to God for help after suffering from the current political and financial situation. The way I've just presented Karen's input makes her chapters sound amazing to read. They are insightful, they provide context, and they do much of the analysis of the book for me, which would be great. Would be. I cannot stand her chapters because of how she is written. It's my least favourite part of the book, I swear to God. When writing the book, Paul Tremblay had the brilliant idea to write Karen's point of view in the form of her blog posts. It's subsequently unbearable and already dated like 8 years after being published. All of this amazing analysis and context is hidden behind poetry like this. The Last Final Girl. Yeah, it's just a blog. How retro. Or is The Last Final Girl the greatest blog ever? Exploring all things horror and horrific. Books, comics, video games, TV, movies, high school. From the gooey, gory midnight show cheese to the highfalutin art house highbrow. Beware of spoilers. I will spoil you. I cannot. Some other jabs from Karen include, but are not limited to, keeping in mind these are all written in the form of a blog post. I asked the neighbour's 12-year-old kid what his favourite movie was, and he surprised me by saying The Exorcist. I asked him why. He said that it was really funny. I know, the kid is a total psychopath, and put 3 locks on my doors now, but you get my point. Kids these days ain't as scared by that movie anymore. But shit, when that movie originally came out, it messed people up big time. Good versus evil. Yay good, the pure, pristine little white girl saved by the white man and religion. Yay white man and religion. This book is written by a white man. Intermission. Karen drinks more coffee. Must have more coffee. This one's particularly millennial. Now, I'm no editing expert. Well, if you insist on referring to me as Karen, the expert of all things relating to horror and pop culture, I won't stop you. I won't even disagree with you. The misogyny is so obvious and pervasive, it's almost ho-hum by this point. So let's go goth again. Karen dresses in black and puts on old Morrissey CDs. That last quote is even funnier if you know anything about the Smiths. So, putting it bluntly, these chapters are hell on earth to read, so for both of our benefits, I'm just going to summarise what's said in them without subjecting you to any more of Karen's 2012 Tumblr girl lingo. It is really giving struggle millennial who peaked in high school and now swears coffee cures depression. From now on, I'll just refer to the perspectives as younger Mary, older Mary, and Karen. The next chapter is back to older Mary, who gives some context on the story she's about to share. She tells Rachel her dad was religious, so religious that when having marital problems with her mother, she quoted a Bible verse to her stating she should submit to her husband. At the time of the events of her story, her father, John, had secretly went back to the Catholic Church, and their marriage was slightly strained, often disagreeing on matters of faith, especially where their children were involved. She then begins her actual story, and for the remaining chapters of part 1, we are focused entirely on younger Mary's perspective. As mentioned, Mary is only 8 here and Marjorie is 14. The relationship between them was complex due to this age gap. Mary looks up to her sister and is desperate for her attention, whereas Marjorie wants space and privacy in this time of her life. Pretty standard sibling stuff so far. They do, however, have a little bit of a strange morning ritual. Some mornings Mary will go to Marjorie's room and they'll create fictional stories together that Mary documents in her pictures books. It's during one of these mornings that Mary first has a strange encounter with her sister. Mary is invited to Marjorie's room, and it's then that Marjorie admits sneaking into her room last night while she was sleeping and stealing one of her picture books to document a story without her. She tells her about the real-life tragedy of the Great Molasses Flood in Boston, which took place in 1919 and killed 21 people. The way she tells the story isn't particularly gruesome, but the dark subject and subsequent revelation that the story is true scares young Mary, and she asks her how she knows about it. Marjorie swears it just came to her and she didn't read it or watch it anywhere. Mary then notices Marjorie's posters are askew. Marjorie tells her the poster moves themselves and asks her not to tell anyone. Marjorie likes to mess with Mary a little bit during some of these interactions. It's kind of hard to immediately tell whether she's being genuine or just seems so because we get the story from Mary's perspective. Overall, the book technically does not explicitly state whether the events are supernatural, but it is heavily, and I mean heavily implied, the multiple factors such as Marjorie's mental illness, the reality TV and the church's manipulations, and Mary's unreliable narrative are the real explanation for all the strange events. The novel markets itself as a book about a girl being wrongly exorcised, and pretty much anything that could be supernatural has a perfectly normal explanation that is spelled out to the reader for them. Things get a little more creepy for Mary when she barricades the door so Marjorie can't steal anything again, and yet wakes up with a note on her chest from Marjorie inviting her to hear another story. Overall, tension in the family is rising, with John and Sarah Bennett, the mother and father, are constantly at each other's throat. John's under pressure for Sarah, who is really desperate for him to get a job. He lost his job 18 months ago, and the family is struggling financially. Meanwhile, John is trying to force his beliefs onto the family. He randomly decides before dinner that night to insist on the family saying grace, something that they've never done before. Mary doesn't even know what it means. Sarah, clearly frustrated, says they should discuss this later, and Marjorie vocally denounces religion, ending in a small argument where John demands that Marjorie respect his beliefs. This would be a completely fair request if he respected his family's beliefs, but more on that later. During the conversation, Marjorie alludes a couple times to a recent doctor's appointment. Marjorie ends this conversation by provoking her father with the idea that his loved ones in heaven may not be who they appear to be. That night, when Mary goes into Marjorie's room, she's immediately asked by her older sister if her room looks different. Mary doesn't think it does, but Marjorie remains suspicious. Mary notices her sister's been acting weird recently and has not been properly maintaining her hygiene. Her hair is greasy, she remains dirty and sweaty almost all the time. Marjorie tells Mary another story she wrote in her picture book. This one's a bit more detailed and is accompanied by drawings of vines all over the book. Marjorie tells the story of two sisters with the same name as them who live in a world that is overtaken by vines. Their mother is absent and their father is acting strangely and untrustworthy. The story Marjorie is sick and hears voices in her head. One day, when the father isn't there, the story Mary goes to the basement and finds the corpse of their mother, who their dad poisoned, and finds out he is slowly poisoning the story Marjorie. After this realization, the house is overtaken by the vines. Mary is terrified by this story, but Marjorie emphasises its importance and insists that Mary remembers it. Oh, I do love a bit of obvious foreshadowing. One day, Mary's mum drives her to her soccer practice instead of her dad. When she asks why, she's told that Marjorie's doctors wanted him to attend a session with her. It may not have been explicitly mentioned, but Marjorie's appointments are fairly obviously sessions with a psychiatrist. For what, we don't quite know yet. Mary hates being kept in the dark about what's going on with her sister, so in an effort to find out more, she knowingly betrays her sister's trust and tells her mum about the weird things she's been saying. Sarah makes an effort to note down what Mary says before asking her to be respectful, kind and patient with her sister. That night when in bed, Mary hears screaming from Marjorie's room and rushes to see what's going on, ignoring her parents' protests. The door to Marjorie's room is locked, so John has to bust it open. When they do see Marjorie, she's on the wall with her hands and feet through the plaster, begging her parents for help from them being the people in her head. Sarah takes Mary back to her room and assures her through tears that everything is okay, while Marjorie and John argue in the next room. Mary wakes up again later with her mother, who slept in her bed last night, and sees that her white playhouse has been drawn on while she's asleep. The playhouse is now covered with the green vines like the ones in Marjorie's stories, and within it she finds a note from Marjorie reading, "There's nothing wrong with me, Mary. Only my bones want to go through my skin like growing things, and pierce the world." The next chapter gives us a little bit of context around the Barrett's family situation as Mary hides under the table and hears what her parents are saying during a serious discussion. Sarah further voices her frustrations at John's lack of job and help around the house. She's also frustrated with his parenting style, especially towards Marjorie, as he's likely to yell and intimidate as opposed to Sarah's gentle and loving approach. This was seen last night as when Marjorie was being yelled at by John, Sarah protested and kept asking him to be gentler with her. They also discuss their worrying financial situation, which is not helped by the large medical bills they're receiving for Marjorie's therapy. But not to worry, as John Barrett has a solution. John confesses that instead of job searching all this time, he's been contacting the church for help, and he thinks they should take a more religious approach to Marjorie's health. He's been meeting with a priest called Father Wanderley and suggests taking Marjorie to see him. Sarah is rightfully angry and is against the idea, believing that the church cannot help Marjorie and referring to their methods as mumbo-jumbo. John enrages Sarah by essentially saying, "Surprise, I already took her there when I was supposed to go to her with therapy," and he is completely convinced that he did the right thing. He tells Sarah that when they were driving to therapy, Marjorie, who he stops just short of calling crazy in this argument, made animal noises and accused him of wanting to do sexual things to her, laughing at him when he cried in defeat. So instead of thinking, "Oh God, I better put my foot down," and rush to the therapy office, he decided to stop at the church. Okay, so to be slightly fair to John, I can obviously understand having your child saying these things to you must have been extremely traumatizing, and it does seem as though he just stopped for a breather and was kind of pulled in from there. He even says that she did calm down the minute he pulled up to the church. But do I even need to go into how many levels of wrong that this is? Number 1, lack of consent from child. Number 2, lack of consent for other parent. Number 3, forcing religious beliefs on someone who's made it clear they are uncomfortable with them. Number 4, ignoring the therapist's suggestion to have a healthy counselling session together. Number 5, not immediately telling his wife about it. Number 6, skipping the therapy that they are actively struggling to afford, keeping in mind that these sessions are usually paid in advance. There are so many reasons this is wrong. If you felt that you needed to find comfort in your religion at that moment, you hold on to your faith, you take your daughter to therapy, drop her off home, and then go take refuge in the church for as long as you want. Going forth, I have a lot of opinions about how John misuses and religiously traumatizes his daughter throughout the novel, and I want to make it clear that I have nothing against the church or religion in general. The problem I have is forcing that belief on someone else and using a religion as a substitute as opposed to in addition to medical help. John brings up the fact that her appointments with her therapist isn't helping, choosing to blame the therapy instead of the lack of a comfortable home environment for the reason that Marjorie is getting worse. This is something we kind of see a lot of going forward. Sarah is disgusted with his actions, and as the fight rages on between them, Mary heads up to find Marjorie. She finds her in the sunroom humming a song she doesn't know and persistently asks her questions about what's going on. She mentions Father Wanderley, who, side note, I keep thinking of a Weatherly. I don't know where I've heard the name Father Weatherly, but throughout when I was writing the script for this and throughout recording so far, I keep saying Weatherly. It is Wanderley in the book. If I say Weatherly from this point onwards, I'll try my best not to, and I'll edit it back as much as I can, but please forgive me, I don't know why. Father Weatherly's just stuck in my head, apparently. So she mentions Father Wanderley, which makes Marjorie lose her patience and tell her she needs to mind her own business, before telling Mary she knows she told Mum about their talks, because her medication was put up. She threatens Mary, saying that she'll cut out her tongue if she tells on her again, terrifying her with gruesome details of the act of cutting it out, the stump that'll be left behind, and how happy it would make her to never hear Mary again. Mary is frozen in fear and cries, but just as fast as she scares her, Marjorie calms down and soothes her, saying that they're only joking, and Mary asks her to sit with her back to her. They play a little game where she writes on Mary's back, and Mary has to guess what she wrote. She writes Gloomy Sunday, and tells Mary it's the song she was humming. When asked about where she heard it, she says it just came into her head. Gloomy Sunday could be its own video, actually. It's infamous as a sort of curse song, and its alternative name is the Hungarian Suicide Song. It's a classical song written by Razzo Seres, I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong, in 1933, and it has sort of a legend around it where anyone who listens to it will kill themselves shortly after. Well, obviously that isn't true, there is some truth to the despair of the song. It was written during the Great Depression and has been adapted many times with different lyrics, all just as melancholy as each other. It was banned by a few radio stations because of how depressing it was. One notable example of this was the Billie Holiday rendition, which was banned from BBC Radio until 2002 for being too damaging to morale. The original composer of the song did kill himself, but that was about 3 decades after it was composed. I know it's not entirely relevant to the book, but I thought it was an interesting piece of history to include. And isn't it interesting in these musical legends that we like to blame something easy and concrete like songs on high suicide rates, instead of reflecting on the environment that humans are currently being faced with. Almost like how John likes to blame something like demonic possession for the mental well-being of his child, instead of reflecting on the environment he's provided for said child. That night at dinner, the family are once again eating pasta and drinking water. This is more subtle proof that they are struggling financially. Marjorie's come home early that day since she was sick at school, and as her parents fuss over her, her sickly appearance is mentioned. Mary notices how dirty she looks, how greasy her hair is, and how grey her skin looks. She also mentions it's covered in acne. Over dinner, Mary starts mimicking characters in a book, and for once her parents actually humour her and give her some attention. She absolutely revels in this, obviously, because she's attention starved, and she asks Marjorie if she can wear her hat to school the next day. In response, Marjorie vomits on her dinner plate, and casually follows that with, "No, you can't wear my hat, because you're gonna die, and I don't want dead things touching my hat." She then tells the family that none of them can wear it either, because they're all gonna die, and at least she knows how to set boundaries, I guess. She then just kind of slithers under the table. Like, it's not really described how, so all I can imagine is just this. Was it worth it? Sarah and Mary are crying and John prays, begging his daughter to pray with him. Eventually she agrees from under the table. He only just starts to pray when he wrenches his hands from under the table in pain. Blood drips from them and he asks Marjorie if she cut or bit him. Marjorie replies that he cut himself on a sharp bit of the table and crawls away, telling Mary that she can do voices too. The next morning, John is annoyed by Mary trying to get his attention and tells her to go upstairs and bug her mother instead. Mary goes upstairs and enters her parents' room without knocking and sees Marjorie on the bed. I have to be very careful about what I say here for the next bit. Marjorie is on the bed, almost naked, bleeding from her crotch and partaking in a solo activity. Yes, what you're imagining is probably correct. Mary gets scared of all the blood on the bed and she doesn't quite understand what her sister's doing, but she senses that something's wrong. She calls for her mother, who's in the bathroom. Mary's mum doesn't come out right away and she turns around to see that Marjorie followed her out into the hallway and is speaking nonsense with blood all over her. She then convulses, urinates, and defecates on the floor. She then sits in her waist and plays with it, smearing it all over herself. And the chapter, along with part 1, ends with this. Fun fact, I have OCD. Not the cutesy, I like to say organised and I meal prep sort of OCD. Like, I'm actually diagnosed. My brain is so weird, like why does a rough UTI sound more disturbing to me than like murder? But yeah, after this I was mildly intrigued. Overall it wasn't a crazy disturbing scene. It wasn't described in too much detail. I mean, thank God it wasn't, she's underage. But it only being in part 1 did get me a little excited for the rest of the book. What other crazy things would happen? And while lots more does happen, I can't help but think that this scene makes the other spooky things she does just kind of seem anticlimactic. Part 2. We start off part 2 with Karen's expositional point of view, giving us insight into the first episode of the documentary. It's genuinely thought-provoking. We first learn that the show is shot like a documentary, with confessionals from all family members with a focus on John. This is intercut by dramatic reenactments of the events the Barretts experience, in which the family members are played by actors and raw footage of the family filmed once the documentary crew got there. Karen suggests that the person who contacted the documentary crew and convinced John to take part in all of this was Father Wanderley. His church was also in need of funding at the time and he probably thought he could benefit in performing an exorcism on the show. She then draws comparisons to the show and the Exorcist movie. These comparisons are mainly thematic and she addresses the more conservative or Republican angles of both The Exorcist and The Possession show. Citing the old-fashioned family values emphasised, the strange need for the protagonist to be male despite the victim being female, and the unwavering need for faith as evidence that both The Exorcist and The Possession are very right-wing. Another issue pointed out by Karen is the age gap between real-life Marjorie and the actress that plays her in the reenactment scene. As mentioned, at the time of filming, Marjorie is 14, whereas her actress is 23. This isn't unusual, and it makes sense at first why this is the case. We don't want to traumatise actual children by making them play this role. The problem is, by making the actress over 18, the documentary crew has full permission to sexualise her as much as they want, despite the fact she's portraying an underage girl. Karen feels that Marjorie was written and edited to fit into the angle of the male gaze. She's often in skimpy clothing in the reenactments and is shot at sexualizing angles. The worst example of this, in Karen's opinion, is the recreation of the solo activity scene, which Karen believes was fetishized and almost purposely alluring for a male audience, with a specific focus on showing as much as they could get away with, which involves a lot of cleavage and thigh shots. It's obviously disgusting, but it honestly is quite realistic, especially for today's portrayal of sexualized teenage girls in media such as Euphoria or Sex Education. The first episode mainly provides context for the family being on the show, and has many scenes with John explaining what was happening to his daughter, and cryptically referring to the supernatural. He tells the viewer about the molasses stories and the gloomy Sunday song she sang, and dramatically confesses that Marjorie's never heard of those songs, and that information isn't anywhere he knows, so it must be supernatural. The first episode ends with the viewer's first actual look at real-life Marjorie, who looks to the camera and says, "I'm Marjorie Manet, and I need help." Cue credits, and what do you know, the tune of the credits is Gloomy Sunday. This is also where the first chapter of part 2 ends, and I will give this book credit. I do actually like the comparisons, context, and political discussions that Karen provides in these chapters. I've only scratched the surface of her analysis, and I do love a good bit of analysis. An extra layer of complexity is added as Karen criticises the show for being biased, despite her also being incredibly biased. This is highlighted by a later revelation that I'll discuss. Not even halfway through yet, and I need my stim toy, 'cause I'm autistic. I just have the constant urge to eat this. I know it tastes like a blueberry slush. Moving on to the next chapter, we're back to an older Mary's point of view, where Rachel, the author, is visiting her apartment and continuing their interview. Mary tells Rachel that after the last incident with Marjorie, she was sent away to a hospital to recover for a little bit, and her mother fell into a complete depression. She drank and argued with John about the church being involved with Marjorie, and John became more entrenched in his faith than ever. Mary remembers Marjorie acting a lot more normal when she was in hospital. It's almost like having a stable environment where you're not labelled as possessed is beneficial for your mental health or something. Who would have knew? Mary shares her memory of the day she was told about the TV show, remembering her father being maniacally excited and Father Wanderley and Father Gavin, another priest of the church, talking to Marjorie. Rachel interrupts here to ask Mary why her mother agreed to all this after being so against it. Mary replies flippantly and just says she doesn't know, and Rachel calls her out a little bit and says she sincerely doubts that, but moves on regardless. After that, Rachel asks some simple questions, which Mary is aware is a test of sorts, to see what she remembers and if she's being truthful. Taking a break, Mary asks Rachel if she'd like a tour of her apartment, and Rachel agrees. Everything else is fairly unimportant until Mary shows Rachel her media room, which is covered in horror DVDs, books, and other media, with a particularly large section devoted to exorcism media. Rachel is perplexed by this and asks Mary why she would want to use this media to relive such a traumatic part of her childhood, to which Mary replies that no media is close to what she went through as a child. The conversation that ensues is an interesting peek into Mary's psyche. She admits to being curious about things of a horror nature, but she gets slightly offended when Rachel suggests that she takes comfort in this media, as it's over-embellished and possibly more traumatizing than what she's gone through. She replies with, "What does that say about you or anyone else, that my sister's nationally televised psychotic break and descent into schizophrenia wasn't horrific enough?" This is the first time that schizophrenia is outright said in the book, and the first time that Mary confirms that she's completely sure what happened to Rachel is not supernatural in her view. This is confirmed when she's asked by Rachel if she believes Marjorie was possessed, and she says no, but she admits to not being sure as a child. Half of my footage when I'm editing is just me putting my hair back, putting my hair forward, and then putting my hair back, and then forward. Mary quickly changes the subject and tells Rachel that she's recently been hired as a writer for a horror publication, and reveals she's been writing her own blog for years. She encourages Rachel to go read it and tells her she wrote it under a pseudonym. What pseudonym, I hear you ask? Karen. This twist happens just before the halfway point of the book, and I actually do like it. It gives a reason for Karen's obsession with the show and her way of knowing behind the scenes knowledge. It also adds complexity to her character, as we see 3 sides to Mary. The younger version that went through all of this, Karen, who analyses the show thoroughly and is an outlet for Mary to share her true opinions, and older Mary, who seems to have a little bit more of a wall up when she's talking to Rachel about her experience. I also didn't manage to guess it, but reading it back there were some clues and breadcrumbs leading to that conclusion, which is always a good sign of a well-written twist. For the sake of continuity and clear distinction, I will be still mainly referring to her as Karen in these segments. The chapter ends with Rachel asking Mary about the basement scene reenactment. This leads Mary to admit that she embellished what happened to help her parents with the TV show. Rachel then invites Mary to tell her what actually happened in the basement, and the chapter ends. The remaining chapters of part 2 is back to young Mary's point of view. Mary sees the documentary crew set up cameras in the whole house. Her family scrambles to tidy and make the house look as neat as possible, and she sees the actors who will be reenacting the scenes go into her house. We're introduced to a man called Barry Cotton, the director of the show, and Ken Fletcher, the main writer, who quickly befriends Mary. Mary goes down to the basement for some peace from the film crew and is soon joined by Marjorie. Marjorie asks her to keep a secret and reveals to her she's not possessed, no matter what her dad or Father Wanderley thinks. And while she does in fact hear things, she knows her problem is medical and not supernatural. Marjorie tells Mary that she hated seeing the doctor and being on medication, and once she saw the financial troubles her parents were going through, she acted evil and, as she says, faked it so that Father Wanderley would help. She admits that she read the molasses story online and makes it clear that the story about the vines was her own thoughts, and stresses that Mary needs to keep that one in mind. Mary makes it clear that although Marjorie's story is partially true, Marjorie was lying about how in control of the situation that she was. Mary believes that Marjorie framed the situation in her mind as a way to help her parents as a coping mechanism. When Mary leaves the basement, she goes to the upstairs room that has been turned into a confessional, and in an effort to help her sister and parents, she embellishes the events greatly, saying, "I told the camera a story about Marjorie sneaking up on me in the basement, her saying weird stuff to me like she had before, her eyes being all white, her eating dirt, making her tongue into a black worm, how she made the lights go out. I told the camera that Marjorie was being really scary and something evil was now living inside of her." 2 weeks pass, and on the day of the premiere, Mary has lots of energy. She said her parents won't let her watch the show since everyone else is getting to, even her friends from school. She plays in the backyard with Ken, and we find out she's been banned from doing confessionals on her own as she took too much time babbling about nothing. Trying to cheer her up, Kevin gives her her very own camera, saying she can film things on it all by herself. That night she films everyone before the premiere. The crew and the Barretts are all gathered, ready to watch the premiere, but she's soon sent to bed before the show starts. She wakes up in the middle of the night hearing scratching sounds and immediately picks up her camera to film what's going on. She hears rustling and looks around the room and sees nothing. Thinking it's just another one of Marjorie's jokes, she yells out, "I know you're faking, you told me you were faking." She eventually sees a rising lump under her blanket on the floor and watches as Marjorie presses her face into the blanket and moves unnaturally under it, strangling herself. Eventually Marjorie starts growling and thrashing violently, wrecking the cardboard playhouse in Mary's room and throwing it at her before running back to her room. Mary follows her and sees her on the bed. She pauses the recording and checks on Marjorie, who rolls over and asks her if she got the footage, then tells her to show it to her friend Ken in the morning. The next morning, Mary leaves to go to school and sees a group of protesters in front of the house with signs, but she doesn't get to see what they're saying as she's driven to school. At school, things aren't much better as her friends haven't seen the show, and those who have teased her about it. When she goes home, the protesters have grown in size and she's told that they are religious fanatics. They have Bible verses on signs and accuse the family of profiting from the devil. John has no temper for this and almost gets into a physical fight with one of them before Father Wanderley calms him down. When Mary goes inside, she shows Ken the video that she made. Ken is concerned but eager to use the footage, but Marjorie's worried about the fact that she said Marjorie was faking it on camera. She takes the camera away with her after, but she doesn't want to use it much anymore. After the second episode airs, Mary successfully fakes being ill to get out of going to school. She goes downstairs and is told there's going to be a meeting that she's not invited to. She has lunch with her dad, who jokes and pretends to be a scientist while making macaroni. Mary says she remembers this is the last time her dad was happy. Mary's aware that the meeting is about her and feels excited as she's being focused on for once. Eventually, her parents and Father Wanderley come into the room to talk to her. Father Wanderley explains that he has to assess whether Marjorie is really possessed and then get permission to perform an exorcism. John states that everyone in the house is convinced that she's possessed. Sarah Bennett obviously isn't convinced, but since when did John start listening to anyone else's opinion? We find out that a doctor is coming over that night to perform a medical examination on Marjorie on behalf of the church. When Mary asks why it's not their usual doctor, Father Wanderley replies that he's an atheist, someone who doesn't believe in God or Jesus, and they need a doctor who is a believer in order to be completely accurate. Father Wanderley states that whatever is possessing Marjorie seems to be stronger in Mary's presence, and therefore asks her to be there for the examination. This is presented to her as a choice, and her parents tell her she can say no, but of course she's just a little girl who wants to be involved, so she excitedly says yes. I'm usually all for giving kids the choice to decide for themselves, but really guys, you won't let her watch the show, but she can be present for the possible demonic activity. Makes sense. When the examiner chosen by the church, Dr. Navidson, arrives, Father Wanderley instructs Mary, Sarah, and John to hold hands and pray before going upstairs to Marjorie's room. Mary's never prayed before and has to be told how to do it by her mother. Father Wanderley tells Mary not to be afraid, as anyone who believes in the Lord has nothing to fear, and Sarah lets Mary know that she can leave at any time. They go upstairs and into Marjorie's room. John just barely resists throwing another tantrum when Marjorie refuses to put a shirt on over her sports bra. He's seething the whole time that they're up there because of this. Marjorie is purposely rude and smug when talking to the doctor and the priest. She jokes her family needs to get a better priest and calls everyone an a-hole. She gives smart-ass responses, purposely trying to annoy her father, and when asked if she's possessed by a demon, she says, sure, why not? Literally the exact opposite of what any demon would say. She then tells her mum and dad that Father Wanderley is breaking the rules of the Vatican by performing an exorcism in front of the media, and cuts him off when he tries to explain by predicting that she will justify this, saying Pope Francis did one on YouTube. She outwardly states that she knows she's being exploited, and everyone just sees this as her being difficult, despite everything she says being fairly insightful and further evidence that she's not possessed. I mean, what demon would casually cite the Pope's YouTube career? She's dismissed by the priest who says she's lying. She's not. And Father Wanderley even suggests her internet access is restricted so that she can't fact check them. Marjorie continues to piss everyone off by implying the priest is a pedophile, changing her story and voices she uses, and asking probing questions hinting at corruption of the church. This is unintentionally a little funny. She just shows up with facts and receipts and completely reads these guys. She's ultimately ignored as Father Wanderley just says that they've interacted enough with the demon and refuses to answer her questions, some of which are entirely reasonable. For example, she asks why female exorcism are recommended to have more witnesses than male exorcisms, something that I think is completely plausible for a girl going through all this to want to know. But he ignores her since he's talking to a demon. Keep in mind, all of this is happening while Mary's in the room and just allowed to listen as Marjorie describes the claims against Father Wanderley quite graphically. I'll give you a hint. The word diddler and the P word for adult movies is used, but still the 8-year-old is allowed to stay. At the end of the visit, just as the doctor and priest are about to leave, Marjorie asks them not to go and asks Father Wanderley for help. She asks him if he's done an exorcism before, and he says no, but replies that he's seen many done. She asks them what they look like and what a demon looks like and if they leave marks. She then asks him if they make marks like this and shows her stomach that's covered in gashes. Everyone panics and Marjorie taunts the priest, saying he'll never really know if an exorcism works. The adults clean her wounds and give her some sleeping tablets. She uses the last of her energy to say that she doesn't believe in demons and reminds Father Wanderley that he's never actually seen a demon before falling asleep. Even if I believed in possession, this would lead me to think she's clearly not possessed. I'd expect a demon to gloat and boast about the possession instead of denouncing his own existence, and with the argument that it's just trying to play coy and act like they don't exist so that he's not found out, well, he's not being very subtle in any other ways. But nope, the church is convinced now. Sarah, being the only adult in the novel with a sense of compassion, tries to call Marjorie's doctor to report her wounds, but John has another tantrum and wrestles the phone away from her. He later apologises for trying to get the phone, but is insistent that calling a doctor to tend to his daughter's potentially infected wounds is the worst thing they can do, so they agree to leave all of it in God's hands. Literally what? You could still be a good Christian and seek medical attention. Despite how critical I've been of some of the spiritual actions taken in the book, I'm not actually an atheist. I'm pagan, and one of my biggest philosophies that I think should apply to all religions is that spirituality, when used responsibly, can be a great tool in addition to medical help, but never as a substitute for. If you're hellbent on this exorcism, go ahead, but you won't have a doctor to exorcise if she dies of sepsis. Mary listens from the hallway as John and the priest gaslight Sarah into accepting that the church is the only thing that can help Marjorie now. The priest, doctor, and John all agree that a girl could never be smart enough to fact-check, have knowledge of Freudian concepts, and criticise the church in an intelligent fashion. Sarah storms out and decides now is a great time to drama dump on Mary, telling her she regrets everything and that she thinks Marjorie is actually sick. Mary tries to comfort her mother by telling her what she thinks she wants to hear. She says that we should try and believe in the church, to which Sarah goes absolutely apeshit and throws a wine glass against the wall, screaming at her 8-year-old to get the F away from her. This isn't even apologised for later in the novel. New sleeping arrangements are put in place where Mary and her mum sleep in her room, with Marjorie and John sleeping in the other rooms with the doors open. Mary goes to visit Marjorie in the middle of the night to see if she's really possessed. Marjorie tells Mary that she thinks her father is the one possessed because of the way he's been acting, and tells Mary that she's still faking it. She then warns her that things are going to get worse and she has to do more extreme things in the future. The next morning, John has another screaming match, this time at Mary for visiting Marjorie in the middle of the night, and bans her from being alone with her sister. Parents of the Year. So they use footage from the doctor's interview with Marjorie for the show, and of course they sensationalise it for the viewers. They bring in editing experts to point out anomalies in the footage, such as Marjorie's eyes going red, or her using different voices, and conclude that the footage could not have been fabricated. Cue spooky music, yada yada yada. They confirm her fact about not being allowed to perform an exorcism in front of the media, but they take it in completely the wrong direction. Instead of bringing attention to her point in the first place, and therefore admitting that rules are being twisted in production, they use it along with other things she said, and boast about how a teenage girl could never know these things without the influence of a demon. They have this weird view that even though she technically has internet access, the thought of her using it and finding seemingly random facts is just inconceivable to them. Trust me, anyone who knows anything about teen girls will tell you they are faucets of seemingly random information, especially when it comes to things that they can call you out on. It's like the minute a girl turns 13, she gets obsessed with sharks, Chernobyl, or ancient Egypt. Or maybe that's just the autism speaking for me. The recent episodes really play into the hero dad storyline. They love to show clips of John standing like the tall backbone of the family, always hopeful and sprouting Bible verses. Meanwhile, shots of Sarah are usually of her smoking and looking depressed, painting her to be the bitter non-believer of the family. Surely she should be taking a page out of John's book and spraying her daughter with holy water every time she opens her mouth, as though she's a broody demonic cat or something. They tried to catch Sarah out by asking her to explain things like shadows in the footage, as if they're trying to get her to confess that it's all supernatural. Eventually, Father Wanderley gets permission to exorcise Marjorie. Meanwhile, school has become hell for both the sisters. Mary keeps getting bullied by classmates and Marjorie can't go into school at all. She's also being bullied, especially about certain scenes in the show. The bullying that she receives borders on sexual harassment at times. The crowd of protesters grow and Sarah's determined to leave for someplace new once this is all over. The only one having any fun is John, who is regularly attending church and seems to love all the religious attention he's getting due to his daughter's suffering. At this point, even Mary, young as she is, thinks her dad is being selfish. Days pass as they wait for the exorcism, and the crew get frustrated that there's nothing to shoot since Marjorie seems to be keeping to herself. Eventually, the night before the exorcism comes along, and the family are all watching TV. The crew wants them to act like a normal family for the night, talk about the show they're watching, that kind of thing. Eventually, they're asked how they're feeling about the big day tomorrow. Sarah gets mad at the crew and curses at them, but Marjorie soon takes the spotlight by describing how it feels when she's possessed. She describes it as a claustrophobic, dying feeling, and asks everyone to stay with her tomorrow when the exorcism happens, including Mary. Sarah and John are hesitant, but Marjorie tells them things will go wrong if Mary's not there. She assures them that it's her talking and not the demon. John says to Marjorie's face that he wishes Father Wanderley was there, as he can't tell whether the demon's lying or not. Tactful as always, John. Marjorie threatens them she'll get naked and scream blasphemous things so that she can't be filmed, and the exorcism won't work if Mary isn't allowed to be there, forcing John and Sarah to relent. Not before John has another scuffle with Marjorie though, while screaming at her. Then Sarah screams at him, then Mary screams at everyone. We begin the next chapter on the morning of the exorcism, and Mary plays outside before getting distracted by the yells of the protesters out front. She looks to see her dad being held back by police as protesters antagonize him with gay slurs. For some reason. Wrong protest, buddy. And signs that say that God hates Marjorie and she's going to hell. John physically assaults a protester in front of Mary and is tackled by the police. This prompts Marjorie to say, "I told you something was wrong with Dad. Maybe he's the one possessed." Sarah has to bail John out of jail, and after dinner, John tells everyone that Father Wanderley will arrive soon. Mary wants to go upstairs and wait with Marjorie, but John wants her to stay down there and prepare herself for prayer. Sarah says she should be allowed to spend time with her sister, and surprise, surprise, they get in another fight. Eventually, Sarah walks out and goes upstairs with Mary and Marjorie, doubtful of anything working and having no faith in the church. She asks Marjorie if she's sure she wants to do this, and if not, tells her she'll call the whole thing off. She expresses regret at even entertaining the idea and seems about ready to call the whole thing off herself when the doorbell rings and Father Wanderley arrives. Marjorie throws up as the tech crew prepare the room for the filming of the exorcism, and once the room is ready, both Father Wanderley and Father Gavin appear and wait for Marjorie to be ready for her exorcism. While they wait, John expresses regret at his earlier sin that day, but is quickly reassured that despite assaulting someone, forcing your daughters through a traumatic ritual, and belittling his wife, he's still a good Christian man. Marjorie is finally ready, and everyone walks into the bedroom, ready to begin the exorcism. There has been a lot of damn build-up for this exorcism, and here it finally is. They enter the room, noting how cold it is with the window open, and Mary sees that the room has been transformed into a ritual room full of Christian imagery. They want to tie Marjorie to a bed despite Sarah's protests, and eventually Sarah herself is the one to tie down Marjorie at her request. They begin the exorcism. Father Wanderley draws the cross over her body and drenches her in holy water. The room is so cold that you can see their breath. He recites the litany of the saints while Marjorie mocks him and tells the audience at home exactly what he's going to do in the exorcism. She's clearly extensively researched this. She scares Mary that by telling her if she recites something wrong, she'll also be possessed by a demon, and even Mary can see this as just the deflection of her own fears. Father Wanderley assures them that this is the demon speaking, not Marjorie, to which she replies, "It's me. It's always been me." Sarah refuses to participate, but desperate for her sister to get better, Mary tries to recite along with them, despite not really believing in God and getting mixed up in a few places. The scene is again a little bit unintentionally funny, as Marjorie keeps correcting the priest when he gets a word mixed up. She has the exorcism script done better than he does. The exorcism goes on, and so far it's mainly just recitations, until Marjorie interrupts, assures them that it's really her, and begs to be covered up with a blanket. This causes some argument, but eventually Father Gavin is permitted to pull up her blanket and the exorcism does continue. She continues to mock them, telling them all the different demons she's possessed by, demons from different religions and mythos, including H.P. Lovecraft. It's funny to me that no one finds this strange. Once again, I have to ask what demon would do this. They believe it to be a Christian demon, but why would a biblical demon start claiming to be different pop culture characters? If I was doing a Catholic exorcism and the subject claimed to be possessed by Gru, I would be at least a little suspicious. They start screaming prayers at her, so loud that Mary has to cover her ears. Father Wanderley traces her heart despite her protests, and as Marjorie lays there feeling violated by the priest's touch, she exclaims to the room that she's just Marjorie and that she's scared, and she finally exclaims that this isn't working. She then tells them that she tried to play along with them, but they're now hurting her, and it's making her worse. Sarah apologises to her, the only adult in the room that seems to acknowledge her suffering, but as she does, the drawers of her dresser start opening and slamming shut all on their own. Marjorie cries out that she wasn't doing that, frantically begging not to be blamed for all this and asking her parents for help. And the dynamic of the parents can be fully described in the next line from the book. Mum and Dad were shouting now too. Dad shouted Jesus Christ's name. Mum shouted Marjorie's name. The bed starts shaking, the drawer still slams. Father Wanderley and John scream prayers at her and Marjorie begs for it to be over or even just for a break. And it all comes to a crescendo as Father Gavin goes to pull up her comforter again, and Marjorie bites his wrist, tearing away the flesh. This causes pandemonium as John separates the two. The crew tries to keep filming but also tries to help Father Gavin, and medics run in to wrap up his arm. Marjorie gets up from the bed as if the restraints weren't even there, knocks over holy statues and rips open the desk drawer. She takes the mechanical device off of it and shows it to the room, saying, "See, it wasn't me who opened the drawer." In a fit of confusion and rage, she accuses Mary of putting the device there. Mary denies it and Sarah confronts Marjorie, reminding her that she said no one would get hurt if Mary was there. Marjorie corrects her, saying she only said someone would definitely get hurt if Mary wasn't there. John leaps up and tackles Marjorie and she hits his head with a desk drawer. This is all too much for Mary, who screams at Marjorie, calling her a faker, saying she hates her and wishing her dead, before running out into the hallway with Marjorie hot on her trail. Mary runs down the stair, twisting her ankle in the process, and as she looks up to see where Marjorie is, Marjorie leans on the banister and calmly tells Mary, "Stay there, Mary. "We're almost done," before screaming, "Wait for me," and throwing herself over the banister. The chapter and part 2 ends with screaming and the thud of Marjorie landing on the ground next to Mary. Part 3. It's time for a final blog post from Karen, who we now know to be an older Mary writing from a pseudonym. She analyses the rest of the show for us, however, knowing now that it's Mary, it's clear just how biased her view of the show is. She writes off the 3rd and 4th episodes as boring and repetitive. It's clear at this point there wasn't much for the show to film to lead up to the exorcism, so they reused a lot of clips. The series' final climactic episode is the main subject of Karen's analysis. The intro is different this time, and showcases the Barrett house. Karen comments on this, referring to the house itself as though it was part of the cast and comparing it to the oppressive gothic atmosphere present in The Shining and the yellow wallpaper. She draws more comparisons to the yellow wallpaper, citing the similarities in both tales, as they feature a mentally ill woman oppressed by the patriarchal figures that are supposed to help her. I really want to talk more about the yellow wallpaper on another video, even though the topic has been done to death. I want to see how I could put my own spin on the interpretation of the story. Karen is finally at the point that she's been wanting to talk about, the exorcism. She notes that she won't break it down frame by frame due to the length of the footage, but she'll discuss some highlights. She recounts the scene where Sarah ties up Marjorie's hands and feet, and notes how Sarah's back is to the camera, and despite all the close-up shots so far, we never get a close-up of Sarah tying down Marjorie, or her bound restraints afterwards. Interesting. Karen implies that this is done intentionally by the camera crew, and that the other drama that occurs during this was purposely supposed to distract the viewer into being surprised and awed when Marjorie later breaks free of her restraints, despite us never actually seeing them being tied. Karen also cites this as being a point of character development for Sarah's character. Her defying the men's wishes to tie her daughter down is the first significant act of rebellion against the men overrunning her family. She then goes on to discuss further links to the possession and the gothic genre, one of the classic themes of which being the villainous father, an archetype that the show accidentally shows John embodying despite their intentions to paint him as the hopeful Christian man. She backs up this narrative by reminding the reader that just a month after the final episode aired, John poisoned himself and the rest of his family, leaving Mary the only survivor. Wait, what? The book provides this information just as casually as I did. John Barrett is as crazy as bedbug. I love that saying from scene 1. He just needed a catalyst to get his full crazy on. And no, you can't call this hindsight. John Barrett infamously poisoning himself and his family, with only the youngest, Meredith, surviving, 1 month after the final episode aired, will be forever intertwined with the show's narrative. At first, I thought this was just lazy writing. It's what I would cite as the biggest plot twist in the novel, and it's dropped on us so casually, as if we should already know. But then it kind of hit me. We should already know in Karen, or more accurately, Mary's mind. And it was in this moment I realised I'd been reading the novel wrong. Narratively, this is a lazy reveal. It's anticlimactic and fleeting and answers one of the novel's biggest mysteries, where are the Barretts now, with a single paragraph. But both the book and the fictionalised possession show present themselves deceptively. Neither are meant to be strong narratives. They're at their core the studies of a character. The possession failed because it strived to be a horror narrative, just another ghost story, instead of focusing on the heart of the tale, Marjorie herself. This reveal fails as a narrative because the most disturbing part of it isn't the events being recounted, it's the detached, blasé way that Mary recounts them. The way she reveals it, sure that everyone reading must know, as if the rest of the world is as wrapped up in this narrative as she is, shows how encompassing the effects of this were on her. And yet, the way she writes it, offhand, emotionless, shows the reader how numb to these effects she feels, especially when being allowed to hide behind the bubbly, detached Karen persona. A Head Full of Ghosts is not a story about a fictionalised TV show exploiting a desperate family. That's simply the setting of the real story. The story of a woman struggling to deal with the effects of her childhood trauma while still honouring the memory of her sister. And the way in which she reveals the tragic death of her family is more unsettling than their demise itself, at least in my opinion. Karen continues, stating that other analysts of the show cite John as the interesting character and his descent into madness as the real tragedy of the show. Karen makes her feelings on her father rather clear, stating that John Barrett was and is the wicked father in the story. She then comments on the moving drawer, pointing out how well-timed and mechanical the movement of the drawer is, and how the camera purposely avoids showing it for too long. basically confirming this is something that she believes was set up by the film crew. She also draws parallels in the way that Marjorie's repeated covering with a blanket and eventual lunge is shot like a typical movie jump scare, leading us into a false sense of security before the violent lunge of Marjorie into Father Gavin's arm. The injury itself is blurred for the viewer, and Karen implies that the red pixels were deliberately used to make the injury seem even worse than it was. Finally, we move on to what Karen aptly names the floating elephant in the room. It's revealed that the scene where Marjorie jumps over the banister was extended or edited in some way to give the illusion of her levitating before she jumped. Mary's screaming has been edited to only include her yelling her hate for her sister, and there is audio removed which we know to be Mary's exclamation of knowing Marjorie's faking everything. Karen can only point out that the audio seems to be cut in order to stay true to her pseudonym. Editors have apparently been arguing for years whether special effects were used to recreate the floating scene. In Karen's opinion, there weren't any special effects per se, however she believes that a combination of lighting, camera angles and cuts, and the viewer's slightly sadistic hope and wonder at the idea of the levitation being real, that many viewers perceive her as floating. She ends the post suggesting that we as the viewer want to believe that the show is supernatural. It's easier to feel comfortable watching a possessed girl levitating than it is to watch a mentally ill girl jump from a railing. The next chapter begins from older Mary's point of view as she meets with Rachel for their final interview in a cafe. We get our first real bit of emotion from her as she ponders missing her mother. Rachel has read her blog and expresses her concern at how detached Mary writes about these events and asks her how genuine the blog is. Mary replies stating that everything other than the name is genuine. They dance around the topic of what happened just after the show, and Mary suggests that Rachel just tell her what she thinks happened and she will fill in the gaps for her. We learn from Rachel that Marjorie suffered injuries, including a concussion after her leap from the railing. She was put into temporary care for 2 weeks and was only released back to them with a psychiatric care plan in place. John Barrett apparently attempted to sue the show for medical damages and emotional trauma after the airing. Mary was pulled out of school and given a home tutor. During this time, Sarah was heavily medicated and Marjorie was on again, off again, taking her meds, and John seemed to spend more and more time alone down in the basement. Rachel then reveals to both us and Mary that John was having an extensive email conference with a pastor of the Baptist church, the same protester who he once attacked outside their home. The email started with them typing abuse to each other before slowly evolving into conversations where John blamed his situation on the TV show and the influence of Father Wanderley and the Catholic Church. The funny thing is, John still believes his faith is the answer to their problems. He's only mad at his last church for forsaking him, not for hurting his daughter. He asks the pastor for guidance, who only replies with an email 3 days before the poisoning saying, "John, you know what you have to do." This is a shock to Mary, who had no idea about these emails. She then asks Rachel if she knows where her dad got the potassium cyanide from. This was the poison used. Rachel says there's no concrete answer, but detectives say it was easier to get back then, and many jewellery suppliers had it for buffing. It's noted that the leader of the church John was talking to had a high-ranking member who ran a jewellery shop, but nothing is provable. Mary is then determined to tell Rachel exactly what happened on the last day of her family being alive. We dive into the account in the next chapter. Mary remembers it was 6 days until Christmas and she was angry that they didn't have a tree yet. She pulls a classic kid move and decides she's not talking for the rest of the day, choosing to only write on signs to communicate. She gets an urgent note from Marjorie telling her to come to her room, ASAP. When she gets there, Marjorie ushers her in and asks if Dad is home. Mary isn't sure, and Marjorie reminds her of the story she told her earlier in the novel, about the father who poisons his family and tells her that it could actually happen to them. She then shows Mary multiple recent newspaper articles about fathers killing their families and ultimately themselves after being laid off. Marjorie tells Mary that their dad must be planning to kill them, that he's been acting weird just like the people in the newspapers. She also tells Mary that the reason she faked being sick or possessed was because she thought if other people paid closer attention to their family, then they would see that their father needed help. She claims that her father was all that she talked about during appointments with her therapist, and when she tried to tell the doctor or her mother that John was the one who was sick, they didn't believe her, and before she knew it, it all spiraled out of control. Mary still doesn't say anything, but looks hesitant. Noting this, Marjorie assures her that she has proof. This proof being a huge shrine full of obsessive religious scenes that's apparently in the basement. Marjorie shows Mary a jar of what looks like flour but is really potassium cyanide and says she found it on Dad's altar downstairs and that he's planning to poison all of them soon. She then proceeds to scare Mary with multiple tales of their parents acting strange when Mary was too small to remember. Allegedly, they screamed at each other all the time, were loud in the bedroom despite their kids being near, and even pulled Marjorie's arm out of his socket. She finishes off by telling Mary that Mum is sick too, and it's up to them to stop them, and the only way they can do it is by saving themselves. Marjorie tells her the only way that they can do this is by putting enough of the substance into dinner that night so that their parents pass out and they can escape to find help for their father. That night before dinner, Marjorie gives Mary the jar, full of the powder, and tells her she will distract their mother while Mary mixes the contents into a pot of spaghetti sauce for dinner. Mary does what she's told. That night at dinner, they plate up their spaghetti and the sauce is passed around. Mary doesn't have any, of course, and is shocked when Marjorie, her eyes red and glassy, asks for her to pass the sauce. She refuses, but John passes it for her, and Marjorie serves herself a large helping of the sauce. Mary is furious as she watches Marjorie eat, convinced that Marjorie pranked her into putting flour or sugar into the sauce. The family's last words are a discussion on why Mary doesn't like sauce over her pasta, before their breathing comes ragged, and one by one they drop their forks and slouch over the table. Mary sits in shocked silence before screaming and frantically calling for Marjorie, asking her what they were supposed to do now. She panics and puts the empty jar in Marjorie's hand, screams that she's sorry and runs down to the basement. There isn't and never was a shrine, nor an altar, in the basement. With a statuette of Jesus on the cross watching over her, an 8-year-old Mary slouches over in misery and waits for vines to overtake her. And here we are at the final chapter. Mary recounts to Rachel how she waited in her room for 3 days in the same house as her dead family before she was found by her aunt who came to visit. She then refutes this by saying that despite her remembering it that way, she knows it isn't true. The police report specifically says that they found her under the kitchen table, leaning on her mother's leg and sucking her dead mother's thumb. Mary spent the rest of her childhood living contentedly with her aunt and tells Rachel that she's the only person she's ever told the truth about the poisoning to. Neither she or Rachel knows what the truth really is. Who got the poison? Did Marjorie intend to kill them? Did John intend to? Mary sums it up with this. Most days I don't really know what to think or believe. All I do know with 100% certainty is that Marjorie and perhaps my father were very sick. Our entire family was put under impossible stresses and strains. We were all manipulated and we were all irrational, maybe even willingly so. And when I was 8 years old, I was manipulated into poisoning my sister and my parents. She ends the interview with Rachel, saying that she trusts her to tell her story, declining her offer to dinner, saying that Rachel will be too busy working on their book. Her last thought shared with us is how cold the air is as she leaves the cafe. An anticlimactic narrative ending, but characters don't end like stories do. They simply stop telling us about themselves. A Head Full of Ghosts is an ambitious work. It strives to retell a more accurate and critical version of the common exorcism tale that the horror community has come to love. What I have to ask myself when assessing it is this. A, did it provide me with a new perspective? B, did it present me with a new analysis of both the genre and the real-life exorcism phenomenon? Lastly, did it do all this while still providing the kitschy scares of classic exorcism stories? It's still a horror novel after all. The answer to all these questions? Not really. As an avid fan of both horror and archetypal studies, I am hyper aware of horror tropes, where they originate from, and the real-life context behind them. Before even reading this book, I already had a lot of knowledge about real-life and fictional exorcisms, and their role in ableism and the repression of women. This book is an alright introduction into that topic, but that's all really, it's alright. In that sense, the perspective of the novel isn't all that new thematically. I've seen exorcism stories through the lens of both disability and feminism. However, I will give it props that the literal perspective we receive, that of Mary the little sister witnessing these events, is new to me. I actually prefer getting it from Mary's perspective as opposed to Marjorie's, especially considering that writing from Marjorie's perspective would force the author to write through a schizophrenic lens, which to my knowledge Tremblay does not have any lived experience of. Her age also lets us dive into the unreliable narrator trope, which is a personal favourite of mine, and yes, you will hear me say that a lot in this entire series. The analysis in this novel is at its best when it's given to us through Karen analysing the fictional TV show, but even then the writing style is... And the analysis itself reads like the introduction to a great thesis, but it's not in-depth or groundbreaking enough on its own. Most of us already know that religion is run by white men. Most of us know that exorcisms are performed mostly on mentally ill women, and hopefully all of us know that this system is morally defunct. I don't need over 300 pages telling me that, especially 300 pages that do not provide any particularly new analysis or links. The novel is satisfactory in explaining this decades-old analysis to the reader. However, it isn't groundbreaking or particularly comprehensive enough to justify its existence on solely analytical grounds. Plus, I don't really like the characterization of John, and I don't just mean because he's a bad person. He's not complicated enough for me. Even Karen points out that he falls into the trope of the evil father. I wish he was portrayed in a more sympathetic or reliable light while still doing some of these terrible things. Therefore, there would be more to analyse, and the novel could function as a cautionary tale of using religion irresponsibly. A good way to have made both the analysis and the perspective more new would be go into depth with his character and explore more of his conflictions as he's pulled apart by psychology and religion. We've explored stories where the religious figures are the good guy protagonists that are here to save the crazy women from possession. We've explored stories where religion is presented as evil, and evil men are forcing exorcisms onto disabled people with no moral qualms. But there's a gap for a deep dive into a man who is deeply religious and goes down a more extreme path, perhaps doing evil things in the process but constantly torn apart by his decisions and trying his best to listen and learn from those around him. John could still be an antagonistic character while still being a more dimensional one. Lastly, and most importantly, it didn't scare me. It didn't even entertain me all that much. It wasn't insufferably boring or anything. It passed as a light reading experience, but I wasn't hooked or on the edge of my seat throughout any of it. At most, I was mildly curious. The novel markets itself as a story of a young schizophrenic girl being religiously traumatized. The description of the book itself tells you Marjorie has schizophrenia, which is mistaken to be a possession. Reading the book, I knew what I was in for, and it was just a case of reading it until I received it. Other than the family being dead, there aren't really any twists or shocks in the narrative. It's mildly entertaining, and I like what it strived for. But it succeeds more in my opinion as a character study of Mary herself and how she's going through all this trauma. I think a character study is successful when I want to sit down and talk to the character themselves, and I do. Not excessively in this one, but I do. I also kind of have to mention how weird it is having a white male author write from the perspective of a young girl who continuously seems to call out the privilege of white men. I wanted to start something for the sake of a wider, rounder opinion in these videos, where I read out a 5-star and 1-star review on the book. These are found on Goodreads, and I'm going to try and choose some of the most popular reviews. These are all going to be direct quotes from the review, however some of them will be shortened for the sake of briefness. A Head Full of Ghosts by Paul Tremblay has a 3.79 average rating. Nullifer Osmokick rated it 5 stars and says, "This book should be categorised as a smartly written masterpiece. I love the pop culture references. Since I was 10, I've been reading horror books and watching thriller movies, so I love the references and comments that writer used. I loved his technique to use all these selected thriller elements and his vision to combine them and put all these elements at the right places, just like finishing a masterpiece puzzle." Meanwhile, Matthew rated it 1 star and says, "The story of this book was silly and contrived. The characters were blah, and I didn't feel their motivation for anything they did. If someone got mad, it felt forced. If something weird occurred, it felt like it was just there so something could be weird. The book is not thrilling, it is not scary, it is bad Exorcist fanfiction. I'm not sure if anyone was ever really possessed, but at no point did I care. I can't even say it tries hard but falls flat. I don't even think it tries at all." I may sometimes have commentary on the reviews I mention, but for these two I feel so in the middle with this book that I don't really care too much one way or the other. Overall, my general rating for the book is 6 out of 10. It's good, but not particularly so. Like I said earlier, the most disturbing part for me of the novel was the climax in part 1. Mixing sexuality and violence is always a good start to creating a disturbing scene. Making the subject a child, and it's even more so. I appreciate that this scene is not sexualized or described in detail since Marjorie is a minor. Describing the scene more viscerally and sexualizing the child involved would have bumped it up on the disturbing meter, but it would have completely tanked my general rating of the novel, as I just don't stand for that type of needless predatory writing. The exorcism is so built up throughout the book, but in terms of horror, not all that much happens. She bites Father Gavin, a minor character, and jumps over the railing. It feels tame in comparison to that earlier scene. I was barely disturbed the whole time. but the hopelessness and sympathy I felt for the two sisters bumped it up slightly, so my disturbing rating is 3 out of 10. A little disturbing, but nothing too evocative or extreme. This was a long one and took a long time to write, film and edit, but I hope it was worth it. The next video should be much quicker as the subject material is much shorter. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I can't wait to see you in the next video on my channel or the next addition to the Iceberg, whatever comes first. See you guys soon, and bye for now.